there's a lot of very violent people in Russia, and many of whom work for him. And we've seen in the past that, if you're a dictator and you have any slippage, you're surrounded by ruthless people. They'll get rid of you just as you got rid of them if they were wrong stepping.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. I'm James Hansen, and today we're talking about the latest on the war in Ukraine, and I'm delighted to be joined by Diane Francis, a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council in Washington. She's editor-at-large with the National Post newspaper and has a must-read Substack with regular updates on geopolitics, including the war in Ukraine and Putin's Russia. Diane, welcome back to Frontline.
Thank you very much.
Your latest Substack piece is a fascinating look at the perilous position Vladimir Putin currently finds himself in. And what's really interesting is the growing dissent inside Russia. Can you just expand a bit on that and what some of the people have been saying?
Well, this is unique again. I think it's because Ukraine has turned the tables and it's now attacking Russia. It's attacking Russia inside Russia. It's grabbed a chunk of Russia by occupying it. It's got a nuclear plant. It's got prisoners of war. It's being aggressive in return. It's no longer content with being a punching bag. And the further they go in their incursion, it makes it possible for them to get over any restrictions on using weapons in a long range, because they're closer to the target. So they can use the short range weapons that they're allowed to use and not use the long range that some of the Americans and others have forbidden them from using, by just moving their missile launchers inside Russia closer to the targets. They're also swamping Moscow as well as Crimea with drone attacks. And so all of this has happened. And this has happened in the last week or so. And this has psychologically turned the tables inside Russia, and I think internationally, because the ruble is cratering, and there are some very prominent Russians who are now speaking out against this war and against Putin, very unusually. So there's a level of, it's an enormous shift, I think, inside Russia.
I mean, what does that tell us about the weakness of Putin's position? Because famously, he does not tolerate dissent. Does the fact that you've now got people coming out feeling more free to criticize the regime in the Kremlin, does that show that maybe Putin's position is severely undermined now?
Well, I'm not sure that they feel more free. I think they're very upset and they can't stand it any longer. And they're doing it regardless. So the latest one is another militia mercenary head, and he's come out on video just as Prigozhin. Do we all remember Prigozhin last year? He came out criticizing Putin and the war, asked for an end to the war. His mercenaries were in there fighting, as are this guy's. And of course, he staged a very brief mutiny and was eventually assassinated. Despite that, another guy has come forward publicly, very courageously. And, you got to remember that they have a military in the government of Russia, but there are hundreds of private militias like Prigozhin had that are owned by oligarchs. And so they could get together and he's demanding that the army overthrow Putin. That's what he's saying, overthrow him. He's also talking about the enormous social problems that this has caused for Russian people. I mean, he's obviously setting himself up. He wants a coup. He wants a coup d'etat. And then there's another prominent oligarch who's also publicly come out very strongly against the war and also calling for it to end. And he's probably backed by other oligarchs. So what you're seeing, and then there's a third fellow who's a very important inner circle guy who's been demoted because he said a few things. He hasn't come out in favor of overthrowing Putin, but he's created problems for Putin. So Putin still remains a dictator. It still would require an army mutiny or a coup d'etat by the military to probably get rid of him, unless he feels forced or is forced physically to leave. It's a big development.
I mean, I don't know. To me, it seems hard to imagine Putin voluntarily leaving power, because he will think he is safest in power, surely.
Well, maybe he will find out that he isn't, and he has a children and a family. And, there's a lot of very violent people in Russia, and many of whom work for him. And we've seen in the past that, if you're a dictator and you have any slippage, you're surrounded by ruthless people. They'll get rid of you just as you got rid of them if they were wrong stepping. So, he can't be all that secure. I think another thing that's interesting psychologically is that the Ukrainians about 3 weeks ago leaked the fact that they had the ability to assassinate Putin at a big naval parade in a certain city in Russia, went to the Pentagon to ask for permission because they needed to use American weaponry, were refused. Okay. What that means is it was disappointing for many people, I guess. But the point is that by leaking it, they made it very clear to Mr. Putin they'll get him if they can. And they were only prevented from getting that. He's vulnerable, he's not invincible. So psychologically, his strength is being sapped.
Yeah, and we know, for instance, in recent weeks, he's transferred air defenses from the front line in Ukraine to protect the Kremlin, but also his home in Sochi as well. So clearly he is feeling nervous. There's understandably, Diane, been a lot of focus on the humiliation of the incursion into Kursk and the evacuation of people from Belgorod. I mean, this is the largest invasion of Russia since the Second World War. It is a humiliating moment. But there hasn't been so much discussion, but you touch on this very interestingly in your Substack piece about the falling value of the ruble. How significant do you think that is?
Well, I think that the Kursk invasion is now getting disseminated to the world community. That it looked like just a little deal. Were they going to get a nuclear plant? What does it mean? What are they doing it for? They're much smaller army. They can't possibly outlast the Russians. But now, as it disseminates, you see that the magical thing about it is that those people, as you alluded to, who were evacuated, those Russians, 80 villages, and then 80 more probably in Belgorod. Putin can control the state media around this incursion, but he can't stop the people in Belgorod and Kursk who are being evacuated and frightened from calling their relatives and telling them what's going on and asking if they can have a spare bedroom to sleep in. I mean, this is spreading through that society very quickly, and so is the fear. And we're also seeing some state media companies quoting or allowing people to speak out. So I'm optimistic that eventually this guy has done a war that's not helped his country, that's damaging his economy. Look, the Kursk raid shows that Ukraine still has game. It also shows because the invasion in Kursk was done with German, American, and NATO tanks. So they've got backing. The Germans are coming out. The President Steinmeier said yesterday, when there were rumors they may cut their military to aid to Ukraine, no, we are going to be and remain Ukraine's biggest aid giver for the military. So the tide is turning. Has it turned for the best for a long time? I don't know. And then there's, of course, the whole mess in Crimea.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to come back to the response from Ukraine's Western allies in just a moment. You highlight in your Substack, Diana, a piece by Mark Galeotti in The Times recently, in which he points out that Russia's military failure also upsets ordinary Russians because it exposes the regime's corruption and cronyism. Can you just expand a bit on that?
Well, apparently, the actual place where they breached the border in Kursk, the Ukrainians breached the border, the Russian government had allocated and contracted out, I think, hundreds of millions of dollars worth of dragon's teeth, trenches, minefield, whatever, to impede any possible invasion. And the Ukrainians in 24 hours, and they had troops there, in 24 hours, the Ukrainians with German and American and British tanks blew right through that fortification. And there was only one way that could have happened, because they probably didn't do the work, they pocketed the money.
So, turning to the Western response, do you think we will see what Ukraine is clearly calling for, which is to be allowed to use Western supplied weapons to strike military targets inside Russia. The West has loosened some of those restrictions over recent months, but not to the extent that Ukraine wants. There is an argument that by invading Kursk, it has shown once and for all that Putin's red lines are just a bluff. But clearly the West has always been cautious about potential escalation. Do you think we will see movement on that front?
Well, I think that this incursion also, as you say, made mockery of his red lines, also made mockery of his nuclear Armageddon bluffs. They just went ahead, made mockery of threatening Germany and NATO. They were part of it, and so the king kind of has no clothes, and I think that's also very undermining for Putin. I hope it is, and I think all of that is given wind behind the back of the NATO allies, and that's why you see Germany. Steinmeier says, yes, we're going to remain the biggest contributor to military aid, which they are, to aid of all kinds, to Ukraine going forward. So the Germans are finally starting to get it, and then you see some other movement that I talk about. You see this cancellation of the big gas pipeline by Mongolia to China. I think that's kind of significant. It happened just a few days after this. So these kinds of things point to a very grim economic future for Russia. And that's why the ruble's collapsing. It's probably also collapsing if Russian oligarchs and other players are getting out of the ruble quickly, because they face either a coup d'etat or continued weakening of the country.
Just picking up on that point about China, a lot of people have said that Xi Jinping is maybe the only person with the power to pick up the phone to Vladimir Putin and say, look, call off the war in Ukraine. What would it take, do you think, for Xi Jinping to make such a call? When might China lose patience with Russia?
I think for China, it's very tricky. They're playing a game. And, he's, I don't see him actually trying to do that. They did pitch a peace proposal, but it was really basically drafted by the Russians. Watch Modi, India's Modi. He's also in motion. He's trying to do damage control because he met with Putin and he snubbed the NATO meeting, and he met with Putin and he hugged him, and it was really disgusting. And so he just announced after Kursk that he was going to go and do a summit with Zelensky in Kyiv the day before their Independence Day on Saturday. So that's very significant. And he is rumoredly, the rumor is he's going to try and broker some kind of peace deal. I don't know if he can or will. It all depends on Russia. Is Russia going to be amenable to this? Putin does still have the final say.
Well, on that, I mean, you say in your Substack piece that the recent prisoner swap between Russia and the West has raised concerns with some people that inside Russia that Putin is fearful that Trump, who he clearly wants to win in November, may not win in November, that he's fearing for his position. Why do you think that prisoner swap suggests that?
Well, first of all, I thought it was really strange. I was pleased. I thought it was a sign that they want to be diplomatically, not capitulate, but be diplomatically open to doing an arrangement or a negotiation. So that proved that they weren't just shutting the door to any kind of negotiation with the West. A. B. The nature of it, the disproportionate gain to the West. They got 24 people back, including the highest profile prisoners, and the Russians only got 10 back. That seemed to me a sign of capitulation in a way. And the fact that that gave a huge boost to Biden and Harris leading up to an election that you've got to believe Putin hopes Trump will win, because Trump says he'll fix it in no time, which is nonsense, but still. So it looked to me a kind of a not desperate, but the beginnings of capitulation. And I think, therefore, a good sign, because, look, I don't want Ukraine to have to keep killing its people, to try and overthrow Putin. So we got to hope that something's going to happen. But China and India are conflicted. They're getting cheap oil. and they're selling arms to Russia. They're actually accomplices, and they're getting away with it in the West because we need them too. So, that's the big nut to crack, as you say. If China picks up the phone or says anything more publicly, and India tries to broker a peace deal when he visits uh, this week or next week, then we're going to see a movement very quickly, and Mr. Putin may decide to announce his resignation for retirement. I don't know.
You actually think that is feasible? You think Putin may voluntarily stand down?
If it's life or death, yes, I think so. But it's all dependent on the people around him who have profited and kept him in power. They have to say enough already. You've done a lousy job. It was a stupid idea. Well, we can't win. They can't win, but we can't win, and we're going down the tube economically.
Yeah, how do you think Vladimir Putin will seek to reassert his authority? Clearly, it's been a very humiliating few weeks for him. Will he look to, I mean, I think already he's trying to blame a lot of his generals who've been advising him and pass the buck. Will he launch a fresh wave of mobilization, or does that carry too many political risks for him? What response do you think we will see?
Well, I didn't mention in the Substack, I should have. What you say is very telling also. Why not mobilize? They are sustaining unbelievable casualties in the field. I mean, the Ukrainians, even at the static front line, are killing hundreds a day, hundreds, killing hundreds a day, wounding hundreds more, destroying tanks, all kinds of stuff. They are running out of armaments in their war machine at home. And, the fact that he hasn't said, okay, we're mobilizing, means to me that he knows he dare not, that would be that would be a step too far. That would really upset every mother and father in Russia, because they know they're coming back in caskets. They know that. Word of mouth tells them that.
And it's already a risk, isn't it? Because you've got conscripts fighting in the border territories, including in Kursk. Under Russian law, you can't send conscripts to go and fight overseas, so they're not fighting in Ukraine. They were defending Russia. Now they're being captured or killed. And so already that is a problem, and a mass mobilization, a fresh wave of mobilization would only exacerbate that.
Absolutely. He'd just be sending more lambs to the slaughter. And there is a lot of unrest, particularly in the ethnic parts, or, the boonies, if you like, in Central Asia, in Siberia. Those are the kids that are getting drafted and dying. It's not kids from Moscow and St. Petersburg. The white Slavs control an empire that includes another 100 or so ethnic nationalities who are really, for all intents and purposes, enslaved to Moscow. So, they're not going to rise up. They're not organized. They're not sophisticated enough. But you know what? There's been a couple of very major protests in some of these areas where the caskets have been ridiculously numerous. And but Bashkir is one, Bashkortostan. And so, it's not a democracy, but he can't just go ahead and do each and everything he feels like or needs to do. So there is a pushback. There is a Russian voice of sorts. And then there is, of course, the ruling class, and they have the power to get rid of them.
And from Ukraine's perspective, Diane, what do you think we may see in the coming weeks and months? I mean, will they try and hold on to the territory they've captured in Kursk? Will they stage a tactical withdrawal at some point? Clearly, they've had a very good few weeks and they've regained momentum, but they'll be wary of not overplaying their hand. What do you think we may see?
Well, I think you're right about not overplaying their hand. I think that the incursion gets them 100 kilometers closer to St. Petersburg and Moscow, missile distance. I think also the fact that they've got now hundreds, if not thousands, of young conscripts as prisoners of war, and probably a lot of civilians who maybe they'll decide not to allow them to evacuate. Putin can't bomb it. He can't bomb them to oblivion. He's not going to bomb Kursk into oblivion. And so they kind of have a pretty safe situation to take pot shots, which is what Russia's enjoyed through this whole war. They've been able to shoot at Ukraine from Russia. Now the Ukrainians will be able to shoot at Russia from Russia. And that does change things a lot. And the West seems to be, more and more on side. Germany is key.
Yeah, I suppose that the big symbol that Germany had fundamentally shifted would be if they provided Taurus missiles. Do you think that's at all feasible?
We'll see. We'll see. It. The problem is Ukraine can't win, and neither can Russia at this point. And so something is going to have to happen politically in Russia for this to change the situation. I'm afraid, and that may require more patience. But the Ukrainians have patience. They have backing. Those state of the art weapons are now disseminating. Their conscription mobilization efforts are working. Tens of thousands of young people have joined, despite the dangers, and they're resolute. They will not be slaves of Russia ever again.
Just to pick up on that, when you say Ukraine can't win, I mean, I suppose it depends how you define winning. But what makes you say that?
I say, in terms of manpower, just that sort of brute force, they can't win, but they're not losing either. And Russia can't win. Given its enormous number of soldiers in the Ukrainian, I mean, they haven't moved much. They initially grabbed a bunch of territory when it was a big surprise, and Ukraine didn't even have much of an army. Then Ukraine mobilized and got back 50% of what was taken in 22, and they haven't moved much at all, despite the fact that they have, I don't know, 600,000 troops inside Ukraine, and they've had one mobilization and another half of one. They just can't move the dial. They also have been unable to defend Crimea or their big naval base in Sevastopol, and sort of handmade drones from Ukraine have driven them off that strategically critical peninsula, which is also of historic importance to Russia. So, they don't have a good army. It's mediocre. It's terrible. And that's not surprising. The generals are probably appointed because, they're friends of friends, and they're probably stealing a lot of the money that should be going to their troops and into equipment. So it's a corrupt house of cards that should fall.
And just finally, Diane, do you think when we look back on the war in Ukraine in years to come, we will say that August 2024 was the beginning of the end for Vladimir Putin?
I hope so. I hope so. I hope so. I will err on the side of optimism. I'm very optimistic. I think this is a turning point because it's psychological now. It's changing the psyche of the Russians themselves and the people that prop him up, and economic global markets. So I think that they're doing the right thing, and but Putin is could also be a rat in a corner at some point and do something unspeakable, which would, of course, invite the unspeakable back on his head.
Diane Francis, really appreciate your time. Thank you so much for joining us today on Frontline.